Welcome back to our channel, dear viewers. We've got a bone-chilling treat in store for you today. If you're a fan of all things eerie and unsettling, you're in the right place. Get ready to dive deep into the realms of the paranormal as we unveil 5 true cemetery creepy stories. In this video, we'll take you on a spine-tingling journey through the sacred and mysterious grounds, where the lines between the living and the departed blur. From ghostly encounters to unexplained phenomena, these stories are sure to send shivers down your spine. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more hair-raising tales from the other side. And now, let's embark on this supernatural adventure as we explore the unsettling mysteries that lie within the world of the afterlife. Let's get started. Story 1. I work as a cemetery operations coordinator, but you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job involves sitting down with visitors and family members of the deceased to assist in setting up funerals and facilitating the sales of burial plots. One day, a man in his early 30s named Antonio, a very spiritual individual, approached me to purchase a burial plot for his ailing father who was in hospice care. Antonio, with a thick Hispanic accent, had a deep sense of compassion that was evident in his eyes. He shared pictures of his father, a kind and gentle-looking man who seemed far too young to be taken away from his family. Sadly, Antonio's father's time came that very week, and Antonio arranged for the funeral service at the cemetery. The day of the funeral was stormy, which many consider a sign of good luck. As the funeral procession briefly stopped in front of the office building, I stepped outside under the awning and saw Antonio in the car following the hearse. We exchanged waves, acknowledging each other's presence. Due to the inclement weather, I returned indoors until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I hopped into one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final destination, where I stood with my umbrella, ensuring the smooth flow of the funeral service. After the funeral, I took a few rounds around the cemetery in the truck, a routine I performed a couple of times a day. With a pile of paperwork and the task of closing the cemetery that night, I headed back to my desk to attend to my responsibilities. The cemetery's closing time was 5:30, and as darkness approached, I drove around one last time to confirm that all visitors had left. Then I drove to the front gate to lock it. It was an unusually warm early March evening, and the days were still relatively short. On this particular stormy day, it felt like night had already fallen by closing time. As I was driving back to my office, I thought I saw someone hastily walking down one of the paths among the tombstones. They turned and disappeared behind a hedge. In response, I honked my horn to signal that the cemetery was closed. Strangely, I never saw that person again. I grabbed my umbrella and ventured out into the rain, following the path the person had taken. I reached the hedge they had turned behind, and from there I peered down a long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. To my surprise, there was no one in sight. I searched in the rain for a good 20 minutes, but eventually had to give up. Back in the office, I reviewed the CCTV footage. None of it captured any unusual movement, perhaps due to the storm and darkness outside. While multitasking between the camera and my paperwork, I suddenly heard the front door of the visitation room slam shut. Jumped from my chair and called out a greeting, thinking that perhaps it was the same person I had seen earlier, locked inside the cemetery and looking for assistance. I stepped into the lobby, but there was no one there. I called out again, and then I noticed the door to the visitation room had been closed. I started searching all the windows, but found nothing. I had no choice but to give up after a thorough search. I drove back to my office, collected my belongings, and locked up. Before leaving, I made one more pass around the cemetery to ensure all visitors had left. Finally, I secured the front gate and drove home. When my wife asked why I was unusually quiet, I simply attributed it to a long day at work. To this day, I'm inclined to believe that my mind was playing tricks on me due to overwork, but the whole experience is still unsettling to think about. Story 2. My name is Jeremy, and this incident occurred in the heart of October during a chilly and windy evening. I reside in a somewhat sizable town characterized by its old and dilapidated early 18th century buildings. One night, my friend and I were seeking some thrill around 3 a.m. We decided to explore a small, eerie cemetery situated about 10 minutes away from my apartment. This cemetery was separated by a highway, occupying about 20 acres of land on both sides. It had a gloomy atmosphere, given its isolation and disrepair. We were intrigued to check out the older part of the cemetery, a section entirely disconnected from the newer area by an old iron fence. The older graves dated back centuries, and it was apparent that no one had visited them in years. After about an hour of wandering around and capturing eerie photographs of the moss-covered graves, we took a break under a massive pecan tree located at the center of the older section. It was then that we heard a young girl's laughter, which seemed unnervingly close to our location. At first, we assumed it might be a toy left on a child's grave, but the sound persisted. While it creeped us out, we continued our exploration. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that lingered throughout our visit. My friend mentioned seeing someone in the shadows of a small wooded area adjacent to the cemetery, and this heightened our unease. As we felt increasingly spooked, we decided to leave and find our way back to the car. But that's when we heard the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves behind us. We quickened our pace and eventually reached the car, which my friend swiftly started. I had never seen him drive so urgently. It seemed as though the eerie laughter was now following us. We arrived at the only gas station open at that hour and checked the back of the car, fearing that something had been placed there to spook us. To our relief, we found nothing, so we hurried back to my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after we had left the cemetery. I had a sense of dread that continued to linger in my mind, leaving me uneasy and unable to forget the experience. By Eric Wainwright. Story 3. When I was in my late teens, my friend Sean and I decided to indulge our curiosity and venture into a local cemetery late one October night. We were both seeking a thrill and felt adventurous despite the obvious risks. I'll introduce my friends as Jason and Mark for the purpose of this narration. Jason's place was our rendezvous point, and he lived relatively close to the cemetery. Our initial plan was to explore the cemetery and capture spooky photos on our cameras. We parked Jason's car in a secluded lot across the street from the cemetery entrance, as it was past midnight, and the area was practically deserted. We were confident that no one would witness our little escapade. We hopped over the cemetery's fence, which was relatively easy to scale, and ventured into the gloomy graveyard. The only source of light was the flashlight on our phones, allowing us to see only a few yards ahead. Our separation in the cemetery was intentional, as we were aiming for a more suspenseful experience. While exploring the cemetery, I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was observing us from the shadows. My instincts led me to search the surrounding woods, but I found no sign of anyone or anything unusual. As I began to search for Jason and Mark, I heard a loud noise nearby. I immediately turned towards the source of the sound and saw an older man, possibly in his mid-50s, wearing a black raincoat and jeans with a mustache and gray hair. This man screamed at us to leave the cemetery, sending a shiver down my spine. I was overcome by dizziness and, in an instant, everything went dark. The next thing I knew, I was being dragged through the woods. Panicked and disoriented, I realized that it was Jason who had come to my rescue and pulled me out of the cemetery. As I regained consciousness, I felt a sense of urgency, convinced that something or someone was following us. My friends and I ran back to the car, but when I turned to look back, I saw a figure closely trailing us. It was an eerie and unsettling sight. We made it to Jason's car and quickly hopped in. He accelerated before the engine had fully started, narrowly avoiding an accident as we sped away from the cemetery. We were shaken, but we couldn't find any logical explanation for the encounter. Mark and Jason firmly believed that the man in the cemetery was real and that we had stumbled upon an unexpected visitor. However, my perspective was different. I had been the one who initially encountered the figure, and the way he had appeared and vanished was deeply unsettling. Ultimately, the events of that night left us bewildered and apprehensive. We couldn't definitively conclude whether it was a real person or something supernatural, but the experience left an indelible mark on our memories. By 9rec. Story 4. During my teenage years, my friends and I made a rather foolish decision. I was around 17 or 18 years old, and it was the month of October. In the spirit of Halloween, I yearned for a thrill and suggested that we sneak into a nearby cemetery. For the purpose of this story, let's call my friends Steve and Dave. We gathered at Steve's house, and he had abstained from drinking. He would be the designated driver for our expedition. The plan was to explore a local cemetery and capture some spooky photos. We parked Steve's car in a desolate lot across the street from the cemetery. It was well past midnight, and the area was devoid of any onlookers. We felt confident that our escapade would go unnoticed. We effortlessly scaled the cemetery's fence, which was only about 3 or 4 feet high, and ventured into the eerie graveyard. The only source of light was the flashlight on our smartphones, allowing us to see only a short distance ahead. To enhance the thrill, we decided to separate and explore different sections of the cemetery. As I began to navigate the cemetery, an overwhelming sensation of being watched crept over me. It felt as though something or someone was lurking in the shadows, observing our every move. My instincts led me to scan the surrounding woods, but I found no trace of anyone or anything unusual. Intent on reuniting with Steve and Dave, I headed in their direction. To capture the eerie ambience, I began recording a video with the flashlight on my phone. It was then that I noticed something unusual on my phone screen. I froze in horror as I saw a woman dressed in a white gown or dress with long gray hair. She was initially gazing down at the ground, but when I looked up, she had vanished. Terrified, I started backing away from the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I looked back at my phone screen, only to find the woman there again, this time staring directly into the camera. The eerie feeling intensified, and it was clear she was moving closer to me. Panic overtook me, and I began to scream for Steve and Dave while sprinting away from that spot. I couldn't see their lights anywhere, and they didn't respond to my frantic cries. Determined to leave the cemetery, I ran back to the fence and managed to hop over it. Finally, I reached Steve's car and called out to them, urging them to leave immediately. Minutes later, Steve and Dave joined me in the car. We were all visibly shaken. As I showed them the video, they had the same horrified expressions I did. The video revealed the moment the woman slowly lifted her head to look directly at me and began to move closer. Story 5. A few years ago, my beloved grandpa passed away. We were always very close, and on his birthday, which happened to fall in July, I decided to visit his grave at the cemetery. The cemetery he and my grandma had chosen was approximately an hour's drive from my apartment, and my family had already paid their respects earlier in the day. I arrived at the cemetery on a rainy, gloomy day, and the somber atmosphere only added to the melancholy of the occasion. The gatekeeper requested the plot number, which I provided, allowing me to enter the cemetery. It was a reasonably large cemetery, and as I hadn't been there as the driver before, I had difficulty locating my grandpa's grave. The cemetery was almost deserted, which wasn't surprising given the weather. I eventually found my grandpa's headstone, parked my car on the grass nearby, and placed some fresh flowers on the grave. I stood there for a while, closed my eyes, and offered a heartfelt prayer. Upon finishing my prayer, I opened my eyes and glanced around. To my astonishment, I saw an older man standing a few rows away, directly across from me. He was looking right at me, and there was an uncanny familiarity about him, I couldn't believe my eyes as he appeared to be my grandpa. My heart skipped a beat. But when I looked away and then back at the spot, he had vanished. I was left in a state of disbelief, my skin prickling with goosebumps. Overwhelmed and uneasy, I quickly made my way back to my car, silently whispering my love to my grandpa. I drove away from the cemetery, but my head was pounding, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something unusual had transpired. As I headed home, I experienced a strange headache, which was quite unusual for me. I recalled that I had fainted only once before in my life, and it had happened that night at the cemetery. I didn't understand the cause, but it was a profoundly unsettling experience. Later that night, my phone rang at around 2 a.m. The call came from an unknown number, and my heart raced as I answered it, fearing it might bring distressing news. The call was filled with static, and I could barely make out any words. Yet for a brief half-second, I thought I heard my grandpa's voice amid the crackling. I attempted to respond, but my voice was trembling, and I was too shaken to articulate a coherent response. The call abruptly ended, leaving me with a sense of unease and a racing heart. The next day, I contacted my phone provider to trace the number, but they claimed they lacked the necessary data to do so, which left me with unanswered questions. The events of that day and night were the most unsettling experiences I had ever encountered. I couldn't determine whether my grandpa had attempted to communicate with me or if my overactive imagination was playing tricks on me. Despite the uncertainty, the memory continues to haunt me. We hope you enjoyed those spine-tingling tales as much as we did. If you're still feeling a little spooked, don't worry, you're not alone. But before we say goodbye, we have a few things to ask of you. If you've got a creepy cemetery story of your own, please share it with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your experiences and encounters. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you found these stories as chilling as we did. It really helps our channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already. There are plenty more eerie adventures waiting for you right here, so you don't want to miss out. Share this video with your friends and fellow thrill seekers. After all, spooky stories are best enjoyed with company, right? That's a wrap for today, but stay tuned for more bone-chilling content in the future. Until next time, remember to keep your flashlight handy, your wits about you, and always be ready for the unexpected. Thanks for joining us on this haunting journey. Take care and may your nights be eerily entertaining. See you in the next video.